Okay, hello. So I'm Laura Dabbish, and I'm here to present joint work with Shavik Das, who's a faculty member at Georgia Tech, and Jason Hong, who's a faculty member with me at, in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And we've been looking at triggers for end-user security and privacy behaviors as part of a NSF-funded grant on social and contextual influences on security and privacy behavior online. And so, ironically, my co-authors are not at this conference today for social reasons. They both have new additions to their family just in the last couple weeks. So Jason welcomed Anderson Hong less than 2 weeks ago, and Shavik welcomed Saya Kamil Das just 2 days ago. And they promised me that they did not coordinate this. But they, in honor of these new additions to the world, our work is motivated towards creating a better future for these new additions for Saya and Anderson. In kind of closing this long-standing gap in security and privacy behaviors between what experts recommend and what end users actually do online. And the challenge is that there is little overlap. So studies of expert recommendations of end user security and privacy behaviors done by people in this room have shown that there are behaviors experts recommend, like using two-factor authentication or password managers, that people just don't do. So as of 2018, less than 10% of Google account holders used two-factor authentication on their accounts, and only 12% of internet users used password managers as of 2017, according to Pew. So how do we address this gap? How do we motivate people to actually behave in a secure manner online? Well, we turned in our work to literature in behavioral psychology and persuasive design and behavior change models that talk about what actually motivates people or prompts people to change their behaviors. And specifically, we drew on B.J. Fogg's behavior change model that sort of synthesizes a lot of the existing research on behavior change. So he talks about the fact that behavior is a product of motivation, ability, and a trigger or prompt. In the usable security and privacy research literature, we focused a lot on the first two of these, motivation and ability, but a lot less on these triggers or prompts that get people to actually enact a new security behavior. So we know, for example, that security measures can often block users' goals in the moment. And so that's a reason that they're not motivated to do them. For example, two-factor might delay someone getting into their email, so they just don't want to set it up. And we also know that people don't necessarily believe that they're at risk. So they're not motivated to use cumbersome security tools. We also know that people lack awareness of relevant threats and protection measures. In fact, we heard about some of these issues with older populations just this morning. And we also know that people lack the knowledge to use current tools. So there's often this gulf of execution between what people want to do and what they know how to do because tools are too complicated to use, or they lack security knowledge. They have misconceptions about how cybersecurity concepts actually work. For example, people still have difficulty telling the difference between fraudulent URLs and legitimate ones, or fraudulent emails and legitimate ones. So we kind of know about this, but there's less work on behavioral triggers. So one exception is warning design. Warning design is one place where we've thought a lot and tried to improve what warnings look like, notifications look like, but they are just one trigger of end user behavior. And we also know that people can get saturated with warnings and fatigued, and they lose their effectiveness. So previous qualitative work has noted a myriad of other kinds of triggers that in the moment people may be prompted to enact a new security behavior because of them. And the issue is that we don't have a good typology or a kind of a schema for understanding these types of momentary triggers. And we don't know their prevalence more broadly. So how often do they actually prompt people to do something new out in the world? So that's what we focused on in this research, with the end goal of thinking about how can we design these kinds of triggers that would actually motivate people to engage in better security behavior, particularly for users who have low or medium security behavioral intention, so people who are resistant to change or less active. So that was the focus in our research. So how are triggers associated with behaviors? And so in the rest of this talk, I'll describe the typology that we constructed for kind of understanding what behavioral triggers are out there, and then the survey that we ran to understand their prevalence and how they associate with security behavioral intention and follow-on sharing behavior. Okay, so what do we know about triggers for security and privacy behaviors? So we synthesized the kind of existing qualitative work and work that has put forth different hypotheses about different security and privacy behavioral triggers. And specifically, we focused on triggers that people talked about that are perceptible in the moments leading up to a behavior change. So this is versus long-term triggers like culture or general social norms. These are things that happen right before someone actually enacted a new security behavior. And we identified 3 general types of security behavior triggers. So the first of these is social, this direct social interactions with other people. So this could be observing a friend or providing advice to you about what security behavior you should enact, or actually overseeing someone using a new security technique. So actually interacting with another person. Then kind of second trigger that we identified from this literature are forced security behavior triggers. So these are non-social kinds of stimuli or external prompts that force people almost to enact non-voluntary changes in their behavior to complete a task or achieve a goal. So they can't get around doing this to kind of move forward in whatever they're doing. So this could be experiencing a personal data breach and so being forced to reset the password on all your accounts to get back in. Or your employer actually mandating a password change every 6 months. That's kind of a forced prompt for security behavior change. And then the last type of trigger that we identified were proactive behavior triggers. So these are non-social but more internal processes. So the people were triggered as a result of seeing a news article that talked about a security threat, or having a routine to change their password every month. Some people actually have that. I admire those people. So that's kind of the last type of trigger. And so we were interested in to what extent or how generally prevalent are these different types of triggers, and how do they associate with different kinds of behavior change? We know they exist, but what do they actually look like? We know from our own previous work that social triggers were particularly prevalent in our own qualitative interview studies of what led to a behavior change, but we didn't know if that was really generalizable. And we also saw that people having a conversation could be a particularly effective way to spread security behavior. So we wanted to see if that actually was the case. So we focused in our research on these 3 questions. How frequent were different triggers leading to security and privacy behaviors? How did these triggers differ across different people, particularly in terms of their different levels of security behavioral intentions, because we wanted to think about how to bring along people who are resistant or have a lower intention to enact a security behavior. And how often and why do people actually share their security and privacy behaviors with others? So we conducted a survey. We did an online survey asking people about recent security and privacy behavior changes. So we asked them about whether they did any of the 4 following behaviors in the last 6 months. And these were derived from our previous studies and also other existing work on security behavior intentions. So whether they had updated their method of authenticating into their mobile devices, whether they had installed an app specifically for security and privacy reasons, whether they had updated their passwords, and whether they had changed their Facebook privacy settings. And then for each of the behavior changes that they reported, we asked about behavioral triggers for each change. So we derived a list of behavioral triggers based on our synthesis of the existing literature. You can see the full set in the paper. And then in our analysis, we kind of boiled them down to the different types that I mentioned. And then for each of these changes, we also asked whether they shared their behavior change with other people and who they shared with and why. In addition, we asked some demographic questions because we were interested in how behavior triggers varied across subsets of the population. And we asked about their security behavior intentions using Eggleman and Pierce security and behavioral intention scale, the SOUPS scale, and that was in order to identify people who had low to medium security behavioral intention. Okay, and so we had 852 respondents on Mechanical Turk complete our survey and pass all of our attention tests, and 807 of these have reported doing at least one of the security behaviors we asked about in the last 6 months, and many of them reported doing multiple of these behaviors. So they, in total, reported on 1,947 unique behavior changes and 2,954 triggers that led up to those changes. And so I should note that behaviors could be triggered by multiple different things. So they were able to report on all of those. Our sample was mean age 33, so it skewed a little bit young. They were 63% male, 53% from the US, and their 47% had a technical background either in terms of education or their profession. And so we had kind of a mix of technical expertise. So our first research question was, how frequent are different triggers leading to security and privacy behaviors? And we found that social triggers were the most prevalent. So overall, 39% of the reported triggers were social. They were either having a conversation with another person, someone warning you about a change you needed to make, or observing someone else. That was the most common trigger of behaviors. 26% of behaviors were forced, and 34% were proactive. And the trigger likelihood actually varied by the nature of the system or the change. And so across the board, the social triggers were the most common or prevalent in driving behavior change, except for password change. So for password changes, they were much more likely to be driven by a forced trigger. So the system mandating you to update your password or change it for some reason, or you getting hacked or experiencing a breach. Okay, so the next thing we looked at was, how does the frequency of these different triggers differ across people's level of security behavioral intentions? And I'll note here that we also looked at how the prevalence of these triggers varied across other aspects of the population in our sample, but I'll refer you to the paper to look at some of those population differences. Just focus here on security behavior intentions. So we collapsed the 16-item security behavioral intention scale, the SOUPS, into a security behavior intention construct that captured 17% of the variance based on a factor analysis. And so we used that one continuous measure to kind of look at the people's variation in their security behavioral intentions. And we mean centered it at 0 so that it was ranging from like -3 to 2. And then we conducted a series of logistic regressions on the behavioral trigger likelihood as a function of the behavior type for the person's age, gender, nationality, and their security behavioral intention. And so we found from this analysis that people with low to medium security behavioral intention were more likely to report social triggers. That's in contrast to people with higher SBI who were more likely to report proactive triggers. And that's perhaps not particularly surprising. This figure sort of shows using so controlling for all the other covariates, including age, gender, demographics, it fits using a Gaussian adaptive model, the kind of non-linearities in the relationship between the trigger type and the likelihood of that trigger type. So you can kind of see the blue line is the likelihood of a social trigger driving that behavior change. And it's highest for people in that low to mid security behavioral intention range, which was actually 65% of our data, or like the 70th percentile. Okay, so people with low to medium SBI were more likely to report social triggers and also forced triggers. So the last question that I wanted to talk about is, how often and why do people share their security and privacy behaviors with others? And so we found that socially triggered behaviors were 4 times more likely to be shared with others than non-socially triggered behaviors. So if there was some social trigger that catalyzed the behavior change, you were 4 times more likely to talk about it with someone else, because we asked people whether they then had a conversation about the behavior change with someone else. And so it kind of suggests that there's this potential for a positive feedback cycle, and that's, socially triggered behaviors are leading to more social conversations about the behavior that could lead to more socially triggered privacy behavior change, et cetera. And we also checked that whether it was just people reporting back to the person who initially triggered the behavior change, and it wasn't. In fact, they were equally prevalent to share the behaviors with other people that were different kinds of people than had initially triggered the behavior change. Okay, so the other thing we looked at was people's motivations for actually sharing the security and privacy behavior change with others. So why did they actually have conversations after they made a change in their behavior with another person? And we found that the most prevalent motivations for discussing a security behavior change, aside from just simply a desire to socialize or talk to others about what they had been doing, were noticing people being insecure, so they actually observed others engaging in an insecure behavior, or feeling obligated to protect them. And this is consistent with previous qualitative work that showed these were common social triggers or social motivations for actually having a conversation about security behavior with someone else. Okay. So just to summarize, in general, we found that social triggers were the most frequent in terms of leading to a security behavior change, especially among those with low to medium security behavioral intention. People were 4 times more likely to share socially triggered security and privacy behaviors with other people in a follow-up conversation or interaction. And we also found that people are frequently sharing security and privacy behaviors with others in social interaction out of concern for their welfare, so observing other people's insecure behavior or a sense of obligation to protect them. So this could be friends or family members that you want to protect. Okay, so we also considered some potential design implications of our results. So I mentioned this possibility of a positive feedback loop. So given that we know that socially triggered behaviors are most prevalent and they lead to follow-on social interactions about security and privacy behavior, we can design to encourage social interaction. This is not something that we're currently really doing in a lot of security and privacy systems, but we can potentially design for sharing to let other people observe what the kinds of behaviors that the people are doing or have conversations about security. The second thing that we wanted to talk about as a design implication from this work is to urge this community to explore the broader trigger design space. So we've done a really good job at thinking about warning and notification design, but that's just one point in the space. And if we go back to the behavior change model that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk from BJ Fogg, he kind of distinguishes 3 different types of behavioral triggers that are differentially effective depending on where people fall in that ability and motivation continuum. And so triggers that are, he refers to them as sparks, are motivating in and of themselves. So think about advertising that tries to catalyze a desire for a product. So that kind of trigger can actually increase motivation. It can also be like entertainment, which could be a potential one. And that's in contrast with facilitators that simply make an action easier to do. So think about an interface where you increase the size of a button and make it more salient. That actually makes it easier for someone to click on that button because it's easier for them to see and acquire as a target. And then there are signals. And signals are reminders of just something we can and want to do. And most of the warnings and notifications that are currently being designed fall more in that category. But we should kind of explore the whole space. So if you think about systems like social proof notifications that we've explored in previous work, these kind of show the extent that other people are adopting a behavior, and so provide motivation for adopting the behavior yourself. And if you think about warnings like the redesigned SSL warnings for Chrome that were done by Akahwe and Orderfelt. They actually are facilitators in that they make this action of navigating away from a potentially dangerous page much easier than if you weren't getting these kind of warnings, or recognizing that the page is dangerous and what to do as a result. So we should explore that design space. And then the last kind of design implication that we wanted to suggest that people consider in future work is how can we potentially personalize behavioral triggers? So how can we take into account individual differences and security and behavioral intentions and think about presenting different kinds of triggers to different people? And so that seems like a very interesting potential area for future research. Okay, and so with that, I will thank you for your attention and thank the NSF for funding this research. Any questions?
I have a question. While Caroline sets up. Have you thought about the role of social media in this, since it's a social sharing?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. Yeah, so we've thought a little bit about that in terms of how people might share or encounter things like news articles about security threats or breaches, and we kind of group that. I mean, into the social category, but it could also lead to like proactive behavior change if you just come across a news article while you're interacting with social media, even though it's not directed at you. So it's kind of interesting in that way that it could be both a directed trigger and like a social trigger and potentially lead to like a more proactive security behavior change.
Hi, I'm Jim Fenton. You had some data that indicated that password changes were more likely to be as a result of a forced trigger. Mm-hmm. Did you drill down at all into the type of forced trigger? How much of that is due to just being required to change your password versus something that might have been due to a breach or something?
Okay, so in the analysis that I presented, we kind of grouped all the forced triggers together. But we have that data. We had people report those separately, so we could look at that. So yeah, we haven't run that analysis, but we could.
Okay, I may contact you. Thanks.
Okay, cool.